Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Constitution Today, Timeless Lessons for the Issues of Our Era, by Akhil Reed Amar, narrated by Mike Chamberlain. Introduction: The Constitution on Deadline. On the morning of June 28, 2012, the eyes of the world turned to the United States Supreme Court for what many thought might be the biggest constitutional ruling of the decade. Would the justices uphold or strike down the sweeping 2010 health insurance law known as Obamacare? In particular, would the court undermine the statute's cornerstone clause, the so-called individual mandate, requiring a wide swath of Americans to procure subsidized health insurance policies or else pay substantial tax penalties? And if the court did invalidate the signature domestic accomplishment of America's first black president, would this epic judicial rebuke doom Barack Obama's prospects for re-election in November? Having delivered the presidency on a silver platter to the Republican candidate in the notorious Bush versus Gore ruling in 2000, would a bare majority of Republican-appointed justices, in effect, do this again in 2012? And in the process erase the biggest consequence of the Democrats' intervening sweep in 2008? Network cameras are not allowed in the decorous courtroom itself. Thus, as Chief Justice John Roberts began an oral summary of his ruling on behalf of a closely divided court, television correspondents outside the courthouse were furiously speed-reading copies of the Chief's simultaneously released and quite lengthy written opinion. On CNN, which bills itself as the most trusted name in news, a historic headline appeared on screen at 10:07 Eastern Time. Breaking news: Supreme Court kills individual mandate. Over the next couple of minutes, CNN's John King breathlessly explained to the world what all this meant. The court striking down that mandate is a dramatic blow to the policy and to the president, politically. The justices have just gutted the centerpiece provision of the Obama healthcare law. Without a doubt, the justices throwing that out is a direct blow to the President of the United States, a direct blow to his Democratic Party. As King spoke, the network posted another headline at 10:09. Individual mandate struck down. Supreme Court finds measure unconstitutional. Meanwhile, Fox News was broadcasting its own headline: Supreme Court finds healthcare individual mandate unconstitutional. Standing on the courthouse steps at 10:08 with a copy of the Roberts opinion in her excited hands, correspondent Shannon Bream minced no words. The mandate is gone. Among the millions of real-time onlookers was President Obama himself, who was watching the coverage of multiple networks in the outer Oval Office. Like so many others in that instant, he was getting his information from broadcast journalists, who were telling him that his proudest legislative achievement was kaput. But it wasn't. The journalists had blundered badly. In their rush to get it first, they got it wrong. They hadn't even read to the end of the Roberts opinion before they started summarizing it erroneously on camera. Haste in those supercharged seconds was not their only lapse. In the months leading up to that fateful day, many prominent journalists had failed to understand that Obamacare's individual mandate could be constitutionally sustained on either an interstate commerce clause theory or a tax clause theory. Had reporters and pundits grasped this basic legal fact about the case, they would have realized, as Roberts began narrating his opinion and they began flipping through it, that the Chief Justice's early pages were addressing only the former theory. No matter what those pages said, Obamacare could be upheld, as in fact it was upheld that day, as we all now know, on the latter theory. The network's spectacular goofs that morning remind us of two large truths about journalism. First, most professional journalists are not experts on constitutional law. Second, and related, almost all journalists, by definition, act under severe time pressure. They act on deadline. The very word journalist, from the French jour, captures the immediacy of the daily news and the oft-fleeting nature of the journalist's message. The unrelenting need to attend quickly to whatever the issue du jour might be makes it hard for the ordinary journalist to acquire genuine mastery of any single subject requiring long study, whether that subject be American constitutional law or anything else. At one time, printing presses and delivery trucks dictated journalism's tight schedules. Today, there remains the driving desire to get there first, to scoop the competition, if only by a few minutes or even seconds. This furious obsession with fastness and firstness makes a certain sense, given journalists' self-image. They are news people, not olds people, and the media's current business model. As headlines about Obamacare flashed across television screens, so did running Dow and S&P tickers. Ours is a world of continuous and instantaneous buying and selling of virtually everything, everywhere. Any news outlet that is just a hair ahead of the rest of the market on a colossal news item might help some savvy trader somewhere make a killing. In obvious contrast to a typical newspaper essay or TV news show designed for immediate consumption, America's Constitution has a protracted shelf life. As Chief Justice John Marshall famously observed in the 1819 case of McCulloch v. Maryland, our Constitution aspires to endure for ages to come. Yet many issues of our day, like Obamacare in 2012, are also constitutional issues, issues of epical import, issues that oblige us to simultaneously excavate a distant past and envision a faraway future as we also focus intently on the present moment and the urgent question now before us. In these situations, either ordinary journalists, despite their ingrained present-mindedness, must become constitutionalists, or professional constitutional scholars like me must become, at least momentarily, journalists of a certain sort. In a phrase, constitutional journalists. The final chapter of this book returns to the drama of June 28, 2012, and to my own role as a freelance constitutional journalist trying both to analyze and to influence events in the weeks and months that led up to the court's historic ruling that day. But my career in constitutional journalism began well before Obama's presidency. Ever since I got tenure at Yale in the early 1990s, I've been a constitutional hammer in search of newsworthy nails. Anything in the headlines that might give me a half-decent excuse in some news outlet to share with my fellow citizens my abiding views regarding the Constitution's letter, spirit, and contemporary significance. My thinking was, and remains, quite simple. The Constitution cannot endure if it does not live in actual hearts and minds in the here and now. Ultimately, as a document that came from the people and that always remains amendable by the people, its specific rules and general themes must at all times be accessible to the people, not just to a professional cast of lawyers, judges, and scholars, but to ordinary citizens. Everyday people, however, have children to raise, souls to save, ball games to watch, clocks to punch. Those of us whose academic careers involve intense study of the Constitution must thus find creative ways to bring our fruits into the flow of daily American life, into newspapers, magazines, and websites aimed at a mass audience. In my efforts to bring the Constitution to the people, and the people to the Constitution, I see myself as one tiny part of a worthy tradition of popular constitutionalism stretching all the way back to the founding. After all, in 1787 to 1788, The Constitution was itself a mass-produced tract reprinted in newspapers across the country. It was designed both for the ages and for immediate distribution and discussion. It was a remarkably compact text precisely because it targeted a wide popular readership. We the people. And the most acclaimed constitutional commentary ever produced, The Federalist, is a series of newspaper columns initially written under tight deadlines and later arranged into a timeless book. Now, I am no Publius, and the book you are now listening to surely falls short of The Federalist. But even as I was composing the earliest drafts of the on-deadline columns and commentaries that are revised and rearranged in this volume, I had plans to configure them one day into something more enduring, a grand colonnade of sorts. While crafting these essays at various moments over the last 2 decades for periodicals such as the New York Times, the Daily News, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, the Atlantic, Time, the Daily Beast, and Slate, I had one eye on the minute hand and the other on the far horizon. This volume puts the individual puzzle pieces together for the first time. The essays are organized by subject matter so that the listener may see the larger patterns of argument that run through them. I begin each of this book's 10 chapters with a freshly composed overview describing how the individual essays in that chapter originally came into being, how these pieces, le mot juste, fit together, and how my constitutional views have fared in the broader legal and public discourse in the years since these pieces first appeared. In countless ways, I have gently tweaked the original essays to improve this book's style, coherence, and accuracy. Although my views have evolved on several points, all duly noted, for the most part I have been incorrigible. Yogi Berra once declared that he really didn't say everything he said. Unlike Yogi, I did say what I said, and I am now, far more systematically, saying it again. In so doing, I seek to offer 3 books in one. First, this is a book on constitutional substance, exploring the biggest and most bitterly contested constitutional issues of the last 2 decades. I aim to present a wide-angled yet detailed survey of contemporary constitutional law. That is, a survey that draws constitutional lessons from every century of our national experience and every corner of our constitutional text, that ponders the intricacies of both constitutional rights and constitutional structures, that explains the nitty-gritty of constitutional law both inside and outside the judiciary, and that folds various criminal procedure issues that are often neglected by today's mainstream constitutional law scholars back into the constitutional conversation. Second, this is a book on constitutional method, illustrating by example how to do constitutional law. Constitutional law is a practice, like surgery or chess. One good way that an aspiring constitutionalist can learn and perfect the art of doing constitutional law is by carefully working through a broad cross-section of real-life case studies. Much as the chess books that I read as a youngster walked me through, with careful annotation and analysis, some of the great matches of recent memory, so this book aims to teach its listeners how to do constitutional law by annotating and analyzing the real-life constitutional contests that the last 20 years have thrust to the surface of public discourse. Because the essays collected in this volume were first written on deadline and originally designed for quick mass consumption, they cut to the chase on issue after issue. The key methodological moves unfold swiftly and are easy to spot. Third, this is a book on constitutional time. Each chapter features 2 temporal takes on the issues of our era. My real-time, on-deadline, in-the-heat-of-the-moment argumentation as each issue arose, and in the newly drafted overview that opens each chapter, my current assessment of how my initial arguments have come to be viewed, by me and by the wider legal and popular culture in the coolness of time. These interlocking overviews also aim to underscore and reflect upon the temporal tension between constitutionalism and journalism, a tension created by the long-term ambitions of the former and the short-term ambitions of the latter. I hope that you will find that this book's essays and overviews, taken together, speak clearly to many of the biggest constitutional issues of our age. I hope you will also see how each individual journalistic essay makes special sense when fitted within a more encompassing argumentative framework, as elaborated by my new overviews. How each brick works best when properly mortared alongside every other brick, as can happen only in a book such as this. In short, I hope you will determine how the pieces that follow are not a brick pile, but a building. Think once again of Publius, whose individual 80-plus Federalist essays surely made special sense when read as an interlocking ensemble. I admit the analogy is imperfect. Publius's original journalistic essays were densely clustered within a 9-month span and united by a single tightly focused rhetorical mission: to persuade readers in 1787 to 1788 to ratify the then-pending Constitution. The journalistic essays in this book were composed over a wider time period and are somewhat more varied in their specific argumentative aims and ambitions. But these pieces are nonetheless parts of a strongly unified constitutional project. My overarching mission is, quite simply, to help listeners today understand our current Constitution. And as I explain in the chapter opening overviews and in this book's conclusion, the pieces within each chapter and across chapters tightly interconnect in myriad ways and on various levels. As with my previous books, this one has its roots in a simple-minded and old-fashioned premise. There are right and wrong answers in American constitutional law. True, constitutional law cannot be entirely disentangled from ordinary partisan politics. Yet law differs from politics, and constitutional law, when done properly, cannot be reduced to partisan ideology. On several of the topics covered in this book, my constitutional views diverge from my personal and political attitudes and inclinations. For example, although guns make me nervous, and I have never kept a firearm in my own house, I have long insisted that the Constitution does protect a right to keep a handgun in one's home for self-protection. When I first started writing on this topic, mine was a distinctly minority view within the legal academy and the broader legal culture. Since then, my views on gun rights have become part of the mainstream of academic thought and have been validated by a pair of recent Supreme Court rulings. I continue to endorse a certain constitutional theory of filibuster reform, the so-called nuclear option, even though any nuclear strike by today's Senate Republican majority would likely hurt current Senate Democrats and President Obama, whom I generally support. I also champion certain electoral college reforms that aim to vindicate the constitutional principle of one person, one vote, despite the fact that these reforms might well disadvantage my own political party at present and for the foreseeable future. I admit that many questions of constitutional law are close questions, and that many constitutional issues may have no single right answer. But not all constitutional questions are close, and some close cases are in the end clear. In these situations, both sides have valid legal points, but when the arguments and bits of evidence are carefully sifted and tallied, one side is plainly the stronger side, legally. Even where there is not one and only one right answer to a nice question of constitutional law, there may well be a wide range of clearly wrong answers. My previous books can be read to suggest that sound constitutional arguments usually succeed. Even if various clearly correct claims do not win at first, they ultimately sweep the field. They prevail in time. When the Constitution was being debated in 1787 to 1788, no prominent founder ever said that a disgruntled state could unilaterally secede post-ratification. This founding consensus is now the undeniable bedrock of our modern union, despite the fact that millions of Americans did indeed deny this constitutional truth in the middle of the 19th century. The Sedition Act of 1798 was clearly unconstitutional at the moment of its enactment. James Madison proclaimed this at the time, and eventually Madison's views prevailed in our constitutional culture. The Dred Scott versus Sandford decision was preposterous when rendered. Abraham Lincoln said so in real time, and Dred Scott is nowadays universally reviled. The 14th Amendment was designed to make the Bill of Rights applicable against state and local governments. The amendment's sponsors said this loud and clear while this text was being drafted and debated, and ultimately the Supreme Court got the message. Racial apartheid was unequal and thus unconstitutional, as the first Justice Harlan insisted in his strong dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson. Today, Harlan's view is common ground for all judges, lawyers, and citizens of goodwill. The Constitution affirms a right to vote in several places, and in time judicial case law came to take that right seriously. What might explain this striking pattern of long-run constitutional triumph? Here is one admittedly naive and simple-minded hypothesis. On certain important issues, our Constitution really does clearly say certain things. The document's text, spirit, structure, and enactment history support an indivisible union, a robust right to criticize government officials, a broad set of fundamental rights that no state may abridge, true racial equality in the domains of civil and political rights, and so on. In the short run, ideologues and partisan politicos on and off the bench are routinely tempted to stray from the path of constitutional righteousness, and many manage to delude themselves and their political and judicial allies into thinking that their policy preferences are perfectly reflected in the Constitution itself as they choose to misinterpret it. For them, the Constitution is a mere mirror. But the text remains the text, and the original intent and purpose cannot be forever erased or ignored. Over the long run, precisely because Americans of all stripes have continued to pledge allegiance to the document and have continued to venerate it as the foundation of our system, slow and steady constitutional tortoises win out over fleet but fleeting constitutional hares. Alas, there is an obvious problem with these Whiggish claims and others like them that populate my previous books on American constitutional law. Most of the constitutional issues canvassed in the preceding paragraphs and many of the issues covered in my earlier books were conclusively settled long before I came onto the scene. Perhaps I have simply written winner's history by first observing which side won in the end on a particular issue, and then reverse engineering a simplistic and triumphalist just-so story in which I depict the ultimately victorious side as legally deserving to win and legally destined to win all along. The only real constitutional method at work, a skeptic might claim, is the method of hindsight bias. Hence this book, which seeks to illustrate and exemplify proper constitutional thinking while the issues at hand remained hotly contested, when the legal roulette balls were still in play. If, in fact, my constitutional arguments in the various essays in this book have aged well since their initial publication, a big if, and one that listeners must judge for themselves, then this fact would be strong additional evidence for the hypothesis that there truly are constitutional right answers that can be discovered with proper constitutional methods, long before these answers achieve universal or near-universal consensus as correct. Because proper constitutional methodology involves more than a pithy slogan or an elegant mathematical formula or a simple recipe, start with 2 cups of text, add a dollop of enactment history and 4 tablespoons of structure, fold in the relevant precedents and evolving traditions, and then let stand for 30 minutes, method must be illustrated and exemplified. A wide range of illustrations and examples is precisely what I provide in the chapters that follow. One puzzle remains. If there really are more demonstrably correct constitutional answers than skeptics claim, and if there really are proper constitutional methods for finding these answers, then why do many good constitutional arguments lose the sprint and win only the marathon? My answer, in a word, is time. When a constitutional issue arises this afternoon, journalists who knew little or nothing about the issue this morning and who lack serious training in constitutional method can hardly be expected to analyze the issue well within a matter of hours, or even days or weeks or months. After the issue is decided by a seemingly authoritative government institution, say Congress or the President or the Supreme Court, the matter no longer commands the typical journalist's attention. He or she is on to the next story and is not particularly interested in whether a case decided 14 months ago was in fact correctly decided. Some might think that judges are constitutional experts, but in fact they are not. At times, they are merely opinionated lawyers with powerful political connections. At best, they are upright and hard-working generalists who must be ready in short order to rule on any legal issue that might come their way: tort law, property law, commercial law, civil procedure law, employment law, antitrust law, and so on. Many of these legal issues involve complex regulatory codes and intricate statutes, with little or no connection to important and unsettled questions of constitutional law. Even the Supreme Court, which hears a higher percentage of constitutional law cases than do other courts, consists of generalist lawyers. Despite the justices' familiarity with Supreme Court case law, especially cases in which they themselves participated in years past, few of the justices have spent decades or even years intensely studying the Constitution itself or the history of its enactment, amendment, and implementation across the centuries. Thus, America's legal and political system is today marred, and for much of our history has been marred, by a wide gap in truly useful constitutional knowledge and expertise. Truth be told, only a few modern constitutional law scholars aim to bridge this gap. Most professors who teach constitutional law focus on recent Supreme Court case law, not first principles of constitutional text, history, and structure. Many gifted scholars also dream of ultimate appointment to the bench, and these dreams can seduce. Ours is a partisan world, and many a scholar picks a side, hoping that one day the phone will ring when the scholar's preferred party is in power. In the meantime, some of these politically ambitious or merely ideological scholars crank out work that is less objective than one might wish for. Just objective or seemingly objective enough to neutralize credulous journalists and persuade or provide cover for inexpert judges and politicos who lean in the same ideological direction. Here are 2 examples from this book. First, Bush versus Gore stinks. I said so on deadline, 1 week after this December 2000 ruling came down, and so did many other Democratic and Democrat-leaning constitutional scholars at that time. At first, almost no leading Republican scholars echoed our cri de coeur. Some right-leaning scholars actually defended the court. Others stayed mum. But this sharp division hardly meant that neither side was clearly right. The harsh critics of Bush versus Gore were
Sample complete. Ready to continue?